And it was there that I continued dating Bruce Porter, the general authority, who was from my hometown of Albuquerque, and was just so happy. And I was looking at my BYU yearbook and thinking about this recently. Not only is Bruce's picture in there, but Paul Toscano, you know, Margaret Toscano's husband, he was my editor on the school magazine that I wrote for. Deborah Legler, who you may know as Deborah Lake, who wrote Secret Ceremonies, was on staff with me. Mitt Romney was actually there. And so I bought into this and just loved it so much. And I had a temple recommend while I was there, and my third summer after my sophomore or my junior year at BYU, I went back to Albuquerque to work. The first 2 summers I drove in a popsicle truck to make up the other money to get to go to college. And I went back and I was working as a waitress, and my mom, who played honky-tonk piano at a pizza joint, kept telling me about this young man that she'd met who was from Tennessee, as she was from Tennessee. I was not interested in him, but we finally did meet, and he was waiting for someone back in Tennessee. I was waiting for Bruce Porter, who was on a mission to Germany, and I was going to, I'd taken German. I'd gotten a minor in German at BYU because when he got off the plane from his mission, I was going to speak German to him. But when he got off this plane from his mission, I was engaged to someone else. That was a different kind of surprise. But during that time, I had not had any doubts. There had only been 2 times when anything had ever rippled across my consciousness that made me doubt Mormonism. One of them was a little green and white pamphlet, which I can still see in my mind's eye, called Mormon Claims Examined by Larry Jonas. It probably came out in the 50s or 60s. And I remember seeing that pamphlet and thinking, this could not possibly be true. These things about the American Indians and the Book of Mormon, this couldn't be true. And so I stuffed it. And then I lived off campus my last year at BYU, and somebody put pamphlets all around the houses there around BYU. And they were from this crazy couple in Salt Lake City that were polygamous and they were immoral, and that's why they were trying to destroy our faith. Gerald and Sandra Tanner. And so I took the advice of my roommates, and I didn't even read the pamphlets because I didn't want my faith destroyed. So when I met this young man, Dan Scott, who promised to study the Mormonism, because I had converted a lot of people to Mormonism at my time at BYU. I hadn't gone on a mission, but I'd been a resident assistant in the Helaman Hall's dorms and had converted many of the girls that had come as non-Mormons. But what I found was that not only did Mormonism not square with the Bible that he was teaching me, but it didn't square with itself. And that was extremely disturbing to me. And it did not square with the history or the archaeology, any of the sciences of the world. My point of separation, and everybody, I think, has their point of departure from Mormonism, that mental point where everything snaps, where it may have been kind of building, was actually a Pearl of Great Price woodcut. I was so angry with this Dan Scott for trying to damage my faith that I had made arrangements to leave Albuquerque early that summer, go back to Brigham Young University, where I was helping Dr. Lyman Sid Shreve do a Spanish workbook on the gauchos. And I thought, I'm just going to get away from this. I can't handle this. And I was sitting on my couch with my bags packed, looking at my favorite book of scripture, which was the Doctrine and Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price. And I opened it up to the woodcut where Joseph Smith has identified as Prince Pharaoh, someone who is obviously dressed as a woman. Does that mean anything to anybody else? People often ask me, why did you leave Mormonism? And I say the point of departure was looking at that woodcut because it was not an anti-Mormon book. It was my own book of scripture that I had. And why I'd never seen it before, I have no explanation for that. But I saw that, and then everything started cascading. Well, I went back to BYU for about, I guess, maybe 5 or 6 weeks because I thought I could go back and nobody would notice, right? And so people would come up and slug me on the shoulder and say, how's your testimony? And I'd say, you know, boy, what a beautiful fall day, you know, that sort of thing. And so it started getting around. My bishop called me in, and he was a new bishop for the ward there at BYU, and he asked me what kind of job I'd like to have. And of course, I had taught, you know, classes Relief Society classes. And I said, well, I'd like to be on cleanup. You know, I'd like to clean up after activities. And he thought I was just being humble, but I really didn't want to have anything to do with doctrine. Then when the Mormon prophet was there at BYU and everybody stood and saying, we think we owe God for a prophet, I thought I was going to die. I thought right then that my heart was going to stop. Well, the books that I had been reading mainly were kind, gentle books about Mormonism. And I say that because they had a sympathetic attitude toward Mormons. And that has stayed with me through all this, because one thing that people say about my own writing is that I'm not bitter, and I'm not. And I'm not, I try not to be inflammatory. If I am, it's not on purpose. But then I came across what was described this morning as a comb-bound phone book, Mormonism, Shadow or Reality. And I had been married about 3 months and started reading that book, and it was just like what I imagined being addicted to pornography must be like, because it was so forbidden and so luscious. And I to explain it. Just because what I was reading there caused me to lose my faith in Mormonism did not mean that what I was being offered as a substitute was legitimate. And I say that because I realize that many of you do not have a religious faith, and I don't want to give you the impression that I just jumped from one thing into another. In this new edition of the Mormon Mirage, I described that it was 10 years before I began to have any sort of emotional stability about Mormonism. And I say that too, not to make you feel sorry for me, but I know many of you are early on in this journey, and it will be all right. If you just stay true to truth, it'll be all right, but it will be rocky. If you cared about it, and I did, I loved Mormonism so much. It was also 5 years before I met another ex-Mormon Christian. Wow. Anybody like me. Just imagine if you went the first 5 years like this and did not ever see in the flesh anybody who had the same thing that you had. It was a very emotional experience. I'm not the huggy, kissy type. This poor man, was hugging me like this because I was, weeping in his arms just to have flesh contact with a real person like me. It was during that time that I started working on this book, The Mormon Mirage. I started working on it when I was 24 years old. I'm not going to give you the details about that until a little bit later, because I want to tell you a few things that happened as I was writing it. As I was writing it, I corresponded with a lot of people in a group called Ex-Mormons for Jesus, and that was the very first support groups that I know of, and they were Christian-based support groups for people who were coming out of Mormonism. And I actually wrote to several of the chapters, and I told them that I was preparing this book called The Mormon Mirage, and that I wanted some testimonies from people who were coming out. During that time, there was a man named Stan Fields, or Stephen Mayfield, who was employed at the church office building. Now, I can't document that he was employed by the church, but he was infiltrating these groups. And as he was infiltrating these groups, he was reporting back this kind of information. And so when this book started to come out, I had been an active member of a Christian church in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which was my hometown, where I'd grown up as a Mormon. And yet nobody had ever done anything. Nobody had ever come to see me, asked me any questions or anything else. And I thought, well, it's time now to become excommunicated from the Mormon church. I need to do that, And so I called the man who was my bishop. He was not the bishop of the ward when I was a Mormon, but he was now the bishop of the ward in which I was. And I called him and I said, well, first I wrote a letter, and I said, I want to be excommunicated from the Mormon church on the basis of apostasy. And I want it in writing, and I will not attend a bishop's court, because as you know, I don't know how it is now, but at that time, a woman could not go into a bishop's court with another woman. The only people you could take with you are priesthood holders. Well, what am I going to do? I didn't have a priesthood holder, and I didn't want one to accompany me. So I said, I want this done, and I want it in writing, and if you do not give me in writing that I have been excommunicated from the Mormon church at my own request on the basis of apostasy, I'm going to publish it in the newspaper. Well, that got some results. And I got a call from this bishop, and he said, Sister Scott, we're having a problem processing your excommunication. And I said, what's that? He says, we don't have any record that you've ever been a member of the Mormon Church.